Hello, my dear friends. An empire that once ruled the world, but saw sex as a tool to dominate, torture, and demonstrate power. From emperors who kept male prostitutes as decorations, to festivals where women were whipped to increase fertility, nothing was off limits. The scenes you're about to hear are not imaginary erotica, but real history carved on walls, painted on plates, and recorded in official documents. Tonight, you will join me in exploring the most naked truths that the ancient Roman Empire left behind. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If we begin with the idea that sex was a personal matter in ancient Rome, we're already off track. It wasn't private, it wasn't emotional, and it certainly wasn't equal. In the Roman world, sex was never just about pleasure. It was about hierarchy. Who had power over whom? Who penetrated? And who was penetrated? That dynamic alone told you everything you needed to know about a man's status. Sex was a language, a code of dominance, and everyone was expected to speak it fluently. For Roman men, especially those born free and high-ranking, sexual authority was just another extension of political and social control. They could take what they wanted from those beneath them, and that included bodies. A master could sleep with his male slaves, his female slaves, or even boys from defeated enemy territories, without shame. The issue wasn't whether the act was violent or unwanted, it was whether the man retained the dominant position. That was the only part that mattered. In other words, the Roman definition of manhood rested on conquest, not consent. They didn't separate sex from power, they saw them as one and the same. A Roman senator could command legions and still feel insecure if someone accused him of enjoying the wrong role in bed. That fear wasn't irrational in their society. The only real disgrace was being seen as the one who submitted, even with a slave, even with someone powerless. If the roles were reversed, the shame stuck. What this meant was that sex wasn't something you enjoyed quietly. It was something you performed, and others watched. They listened. They gossiped. They judged. A man's worth could rise or fall depending on who he was seen with, or how he was rumoured to behave in private. And since sex was rarely private, the risk was constant. Your rivals might send someone to spy, or worse, invent stories that others would be eager to believe. Once your reputation had a crack, it didn't take long for the whole image to shatter. This is why Roman men obsessed over control, not just of others, but of themselves. Their posture, their expressions, even the way they spoke had to project certainty. Softness was dangerous. Hesitation could be mistaken for weakness, and weakness, in Rome, was unforgivable, especially when it came to sex. They didn't fear the act. They feared being seen as the one without power. Public displays of dominance weren't limited to politics or military triumphs. They extended into the home, the banquet, the bathhouse. A man surrounded himself with people he could command and bodies he could possess. The more he was seen asserting himself, the more others respected his masculinity. But it wasn't just about action. It was about perception. He didn't need to do anything in public. The assumption that he was the one in charge was enough to sustain his image. The tragedy is that so much of it was theatre. People acted out roles. They said what was expected. They kept quiet when they saw something that might challenge the dominant view. A man who preferred tenderness had to fake aggression. A man who felt uncomfortable had to laugh at crude jokes. And no one dared admit vulnerability. Because in Rome, to admit weakness in sex was to surrender your place in the hierarchy. And once you slipped, there was no climbing back. It went even deeper than that. These rules applied not only to who you slept with, but also how you related to your family. A father was expected to keep strict control over his household. That included the sexual behaviour of his wife, his daughters, and his slaves. If a woman in his house was rumoured to be promiscuous, it wasn't just her reputation that suffered, his honour was questioned. People wondered if he had lost his grip, if he had failed to dominate what was his. The male body in Rome was not just a tool of war, but a weapon of control. To be admired, it had to be disciplined. To be feared, it had to appear untouchable. And to be respected, it had to dominate. Even in moments of intimacy, a Roman man was still expected to act like a commander. Passion was allowed, submission was not. The contrast between the two shaped everything from personal relationships to imperial propaganda. Statues of Roman leaders often showed them half naked, muscular and firm. Not to arouse, but to assert. Their bodies were symbols of order, just like their military banners or their laws. And yet, those same bodies were always under scrutiny. One whispered accusation, one scrawl on a wall, and their strength could become the object of ridicule because no amount of muscle could save a man whose bedroom conduct was called into question. The double standard was clear. Women were not judged by whether they dominated or submitted. They were judged by who they belonged to. A woman's sexuality was not hers. It was a reflection of her male guardian status. If she misbehaved, it meant he had failed. But for men, their own bodies were the battlefield. They had to dominate constantly or face consequences that no battlefield loss could compare with. So when we speak of Roman sexuality, we're not just talking about preferences or habits. We're talking about a structure of power so rigid, so deeply embedded, that even a smile could be misinterpreted, even a sigh could be dangerous, and every interaction was a performance with real stakes. That is what made Roman sex politics more brutal than any law code. It wasn't enforced by soldiers, it was enforced by everyone around you. Sex was not something that happened behind closed doors. It walked into the forum with you, it sat with you at dinner, it followed you into the Senate. The pressure to appear dominant never lifted, and those who slipped were remembered not for what they achieved, but for what people believed they allowed. That's how gossip worked. It stuck harder than history. There was no neutral ground. You either dominated or you were mocked. You either acted the part or you were left behind. In Rome, being a man meant winning even in places where no one claimed to be keeping score. And losing that image could end everything. No title, no statue, no victory could erase what others whispered about your body. That obsession shaped every law, every custom, every fear. It wasn't morality, it was survival. And that survival depended not just on who you conquered in war, but who you conquered in bed, or who people thought you did. Next, we'll see what happened when that fragile performance failed. A scandal that touched the most powerful man in Rome. A whisper that never stopped echoing. His name was Julius Caesar, and the story is just beginning. That fragile image of dominance, which Roman men worked so hard to preserve, came with a safety net built into their society's slavery. Because while Roman law and custom judged a man harshly if he appeared submissive, it gave him nearly unlimited freedom when it came to people below him. And no one was lower in the social order than a slave. A Roman citizen could engage in all the sexual activity he wanted with a slave, and not a single eyebrow would be raised. Not by law, not by religion, not even by gossip. There was no shame in it because, in their logic, a slave wasn't a real person in the way a citizen was. Slaves were seen as property, and using one sexually wasn't considered adultery. A man's loyalty to his wife was measured not by his behaviour, but by whether he kept other freeborn women out of his bed. A slave did not count. That exception created a loophole wide enough to hide entire brothels inside it. And it wasn't just men using female slaves. The same principle applied to male slaves too. Imagine if today's marriage vows included a clause that said, unless it's with someone who legally counts as furniture. That's how detached Roman ethics were from ideas of mutual consent or emotional fidelity. The body of a slave was a sanctioned outlet. It didn't provoke jealousy, didn't require explanation, and didn't challenge the man's honour. It was expected, even encouraged, as a part of managing the household. These arrangements weren't discreet. They didn't have to be. A rich Roman home might have included several young boys and girls chosen not just for labour, but for sexual service. Their presence was obvious. Their function was understood. There were no whispered scandals or secret rendezvous. Their masters claimed them openly, sometimes assigning them nicknames that joked about their duties. And this wasn't a rare exception. It was common practice across villas, apartments, and even military camps. To the Romans, a man was only guilty of infidelity if he involved a free woman or a married citizen's wife. That was the line. Everything beneath that line was permitted, and as strange as it sounds now, no one worried about the morality of it. The concern was always status, protecting family honour, and family honour had nothing to do with how you treated people who lacked legal standing. This setup allowed Roman men to live with constant contradiction. They could promote virtue in public speeches while exploiting half their household at home. They could campaign on the value of discipline while keeping a favourite slave boy in their private quarters. It wasn't hypocrisy by Roman standards. It was simply how things worked. The system was built to protect men's reputations while giving them unrestricted access to bodies considered unworthy of defence. Women didn't get this freedom. Their sexuality was guarded, monitored, and restricted, even inside marriage. A Roman woman accused of being with a slave could face severe consequences, not just social exile, but legal punishment too. She could be disowned by her father, divorced by her husband, or even executed if her family chose to treat it as a matter of grave dishonour. In contrast, if her husband took a teenage slave into his bed, she was expected to ignore it. Her silence was a form of loyalty. What's disturbing is not just the double standard, but how comfortable everyone was with it. There was no pushback, no legal reform, no recorded protests. Slaves were used in this way for generations, and the practice was passed down like any other household skill. Mothers might even teach daughters how to avoid becoming jealous, how to endure the presence of concubines without complaint. It was seen as part of being a Roman wife. The use of slaves for sex wasn't just allowed, it was institutionalized. Even in military settings, commanders were given young attendants for personal use. In the writings of Roman historians, such arrangements are described with clinical normalcy. These accounts don't hide or dramatize the relationships. They mention them as plainly as one might list dinner guests. And again, the point was not emotional connection, it was ownership. Some inscriptions and poems joke about these relationships. Some are cruel, some are mocking, but almost no one questions the morality of what was happening. The concern was always whether a man was acting too fond, too soft, too attached. Those were the real dangers, not the use of another human being, but the perception that you had forgotten your place as master. A Roman could sleep with a dozen slaves and still be admired, but if he showed too much affection to one, his peers might start talking. This system blurred the lines between private desire and public power. A man's household was a mirror of his rank. The more control he displayed, the more respect he earned. A wife who obeyed, slaves who submitted, and children who mirrored his values all reinforced his standing. Sex was folded into this structure. It wasn't questioned, because it wasn't separate. It was another form of command. It's tempting to assume that all men use their slaves this way, but that wasn't necessarily true. Some may have abstained, some may have felt discomfort, but refusing this kind of dominance came with a price. If a man did not assert his rights, others might assume he lacked the strength to do so. In a world so obsessed with hierarchy, even mercy could look like weakness. Silence could invite suspicion, and restraint could be seen as rebellion against your status. Slaves, of course, had no say. They could not legally refuse. There was no concept of rape when it involved a slave. Consent was irrelevant. Some may have tried to resist, but the consequences were brutal. Others may have tried to survive by becoming favourites, trading physical access for better treatment, but that didn't make it a choice, it made it a survival strategy. The normalisation of this behaviour left a deep scar in Roman culture. It infected literature, family life, and even religion. Gods were often imagined in stories that mirrored the actions of elite men. Jupiter himself was portrayed as a sexual conqueror, taking what he wanted, when he wanted. These myths didn't challenge power, they justified it. They reinforced the idea that domination was divine and submission was natural. Looking at it now, it's hard to ignore how thoroughly Rome tied sex to control. Nothing was sacred, nothing was truly private, and the cruelty wasn't in hidden corners. It was at the centre of how society operated. What shocks us today is the structure they call order. Next, we'll look at how Rome institutionalised that order even further, creating entire neighbourhoods, registries, and tax codes for a practice they saw as perfectly normal prostitution. But not all prostitutes were created equal, and in Rome, the difference between shame and celebration could come down to one coin and a public stage. If the sexual use of slaves helped men maintain control in private, Rome had another system to help manage desire in public. It was prostitution. But unlike in many other ancient cultures, where it remained unofficial or hidden, the Roman Empire didn't just tolerate prostitution, it structured it, regulated it, and taxed it. The business of selling sex became part of Rome's economy, its neighbourhoods, and even its festivals. And once again, the purpose was never pleasure, it was control. Sex for sale wasn't treated as a shameful back-alley secret. It was written into the laws. Prostitutes were required to register with local authorities. Their names, their services, even their fees could be listed in ledgers. The state didn't protect them from harm, but it made sure to take a portion of their earnings. They were both ignored and used. Their labour was seen as necessary, but their dignity was erased in the process. Imagine a world where the government gives you a license to be used, but never a shield to feel safe. That was Rome. There were no health checks, no rights, no protections, only taxes and expectations. And while prostitution was legal, it came with a permanent social stain. A registered prostitute could never marry a freeborn citizen. Her children were excluded from respectable inheritance. And even if she left the trade, the legal mark remained on her record. But within that world, there was structure, a hierarchy. Not all prostitutes were equal. Some worked in dark alley stalls called cubicular behind taverns. Others were attached to brothels controlled by powerful men, and a few operated independently, charging more and choosing their clients. There were streetwalkers, bathhouse workers, party girls, and performers. Some were slaves forced into it. Others were free women driven by poverty or circumstance. The lines between choice and coercion were always blurred. Roman cities had entire districts known for prostitution. These weren't slums hidden on the outskirts. They were woven into the city, near temples, along marketplaces, close to military barracks. Some streets even got their names from the services offered there. At night, oil lamps marked the entrances, and clients didn't have to guess. Lists of services and prices were sometimes scratched into the walls. Even the graffiti joined in, mocking or praising certain workers by name. Some brothels were plain stone rooms with nothing but a cot and a wall carving. Others catered to wealthier men, with paintings, cushions, and wine. The decor didn't hide the function, it advertised it. Frescoes on the walls depicted graphic scenes, offering previews like a menu, and the more upscale the place, the more exotic the theme. Egyptian motifs, Greek myths, wild animals. It wasn't about art, it was about fantasy. The irony was that the elite men who denounced public vulgarity often spent their nights paying for the same. Senators visited brothels, sometimes in disguise, sometimes proudly. Some even hosted their events, hiring groups of prostitutes for private feasts. These weren't quiet affairs. They were spectacles, dancers, music, flowing wine, and staged sex acts. In some circles, hosting an outrageous party was seen as a sign of wealth and sophistication. The women at these events were often chosen for their novelty. Some were known for their singing, others for their flexibility or unusual talents. They weren't called by their real names. They had stage names, short nicknames, or simply labels. They were commodities, passed around, evaluated, praised or dismissed. And though they stood at the centre of attention, they held no real power. In literature, these women appear often, sometimes as temptresses, other times as punchlines. Poets wrote verses comparing their bodies to temples or storms, but never as people. They were metaphors, not individuals. The public could admire their beauty while scorning their profession. A man might boast of sleeping with a famous courtesan, but never marry her. Her status remained fixed, no matter her fame. Even the gods seemed to allow it. Venus, the goddess of love, had temples where some rituals resembled commercial sex. Certain festivals encouraged loosened morals. During Saturnalia, slaves and masters swapped roles, and sexual behaviour became theatrical. In those moments, prostitutes were no longer invisible. They were centre stage. But as soon as the celebration ended, they returned to their corners, used and then discarded again. The legal codes reinforced their status. If a prostitute was assaulted, the penalties were lighter than if it happened to a citizen woman. If she became pregnant, her child was automatically excluded from citizenship unless the father was known and approved. And if she tried to leave the profession and marry up, the law blocked her. Once registered, always marked. Rome's tolerance of sex work was never about respect. It was about boundaries. And yet, within that system, some women found ways to rise. A few became so well known that their names appeared in poetry and plays. They attracted wealthy clients, amassed property, and even sponsored events. But even then, their ceiling was low. No matter how clever or rich they became, they could never cross the final line. They could entertain the ruling class, but they could never join it. Looking at Rome's approach to prostitution, what stands out most is how organised the exploitation was. There was no pretense, no moral justification, just structure. It was a machine, and every part of it fed the power of men. The women were necessary but disposable, celebrated but never safe, and their existence helped reinforce the idea that power meant access, that control over bodies was the natural right of those who ruled. What shocks us is not that prostitution existed, it's that it was turned into policy, that it was tracked, taxed, and mapped like any other civic duty. Rome didn't hide this part of itself, it embraced it, wove it into architecture, law, and daily life. And for Roman men, paying for sex was not a vice, it was a privilege. Next, we'll go deeper into that privilege, to a holiday where rules vanished, whips replaced flowers, and sex became a sacred ritual, a celebration so chaotic it made the gods blush. Welcome to the Lupercalia. If Rome could turn sex into law, it could just as easily turn it into religion, and few festivals captured that strange blend of faith and flesh better than Lupercalia. Every year, in the middle of February, the city lets go of its usual constraints. Rules were relaxed, roles were reversed, and beneath the surface of celebration, something far more primal was on display. This wasn't just a party. It was a ritual with centuries of tradition, animal blood, and public nudity. The Romans called it sacred. Outsiders would have called it chaos. The event began with priests, known as Luperci, sacrificing goats and a dog in the Lupercal cave, the legendary birthplace of Rome's founders, Romulus and Remus. From the skins of those animals, they cut thin leather strips called februa. Then, almost immediately, the real spectacle started. The priests, naked or nearly so, ran through the streets of the Palatine Hill, lashing women gently with the strips, and the women did not run away. They lined up willingly, because in the Roman mind, being struck by goat-hide whips was believed to boost fertility and ease childbirth. Nothing says romance like getting hit with freshly skinned goat leather in the name of divine approval. But this wasn't treated as strange. It was celebrated. The crowd cheered. Wine flowed freely. The laughter was loud, and the rules of modesty were suspended for a day. Even high-born women, normally cloaked in layers of silk and protocol, would take part. Getting whipped by a Lupercus was a lucky charm, not an embarrassment. The atmosphere was unlike anything else in the Roman calendar. There were no formal speeches, no carefully choreographed processions, just a wave of bodies, sweat, wine, and tradition moving through the city like a living current. The line between priest and reveller blurred quickly, and that was the point. The sacred wasn't supposed to feel clean or orderly, it was meant to be raw. The Romans believed that the body could be a vessel for divine force, especially when stirred by fear, pleasure, or pain. The connection to sex was never directly spoken, but always understood. Lupercalia honoured fertility in all its forms. Women were blessed through lashes. Men proved their virility by running, shouting, and showing themselves without shame. And behind the rituals, parties took shape. Small gatherings turned into drinking contests. Private corners turned into public displays. The energy didn't return to normal when the sun went down. It only grew. The government, far from banning the event, supported it, even as Rome became more structured, more bureaucratic. Lupercalia remained untouchable for centuries. It was a cultural pressure valve, a time to indulge impulses that were normally hidden, and because it was framed as a religious rite, almost nothing was off limits. If a senator joined in the whipping, people laughed. If a general got drunk and kissed a stranger in public, it became a story, not a scandal. The deeper reason this festival lasted so long was its mythological weight. It was rooted in the origin story of Rome itself. The wolf who nursed Romulus and Remus symbolized wildness, instinct, and survival. Lupercalia was a tribute to that wolf spirit, to the idea that civilization needed moments of release. And if that release looked like a frenzy of half-naked men chasing women with goatskin lashes, so be it. It's hard not to notice that the same culture that preached order and virtue made space for a yearly riot in the name of the gods. Roman discipline was always balanced by Roman indulgence. Their leaders spoke of restraint while secretly funding the chaos. The contradiction wasn't hidden, it was embraced. One day of madness helped preserve 12 months of control. That was the logic. And yet, as the empire shifted, so did its tolerance for older pagan customs. By the time Christianity spread through the ruling class, Lupercalia began to feel less like religion and more like heresy. Church leaders condemned it. They saw the nakedness, the drunkenness, the sexual energy, and labelled it a danger to Christian morality. There were efforts to reinterpret the festival, to replace it with saints and symbols, but old habits die hard. The last documented Lupercalia took place in the late 5th century, under the rule of Pope Gelasius III. He denounced the practice as indecent and unfit for a Christian city, and though some Romans resisted, the tide had turned. 1,000 years of tradition ended not with a riot, but with a decree. Whips were hung up, temples were repurposed, and the wild energy that once pulsed through the city every February was folded into something tamer. What remained was memory, and some believe echoes of Lupercalia lived on in later customs. Valentine's Day, with its arrows, hearts, and rituals of courtship, has been loosely linked to the older festival. But whatever resemblance exists is pale compared to the original. The real Lupercalia was not about cards or chocolates. It was about fertility, violence, and a thin veil between human and beast. It also revealed something uncomfortable about Roman values, that even religion, The thing most societies used to restrain passion was used to unleash it here. The gods didn't demand piety. They demanded proof of strength, of virility, of courage to step outside normal roles. Lupercalia gave Roman men the stage to perform that proof, and women, willingly or not, played their part too. What makes it unsettling is how joyfully it was done. There was no fear, no guilt, only cheers and celebration. In the streets of the greatest empire, people proved their devotion not through silence and prayer, but through flesh and noise. They believed this pleased the divine. And maybe, for a while, it did. But as Rome changed, the festival's survival became impossible. A new god now ruled the empire, one who demanded humility over spectacle, modesty over excess, and in that world, Lupercalia no longer had a place. Next, we'll turn from public rituals to private chambers, where what started as a toast could end in a room full of bodies. Roman banquets were never just about food, they were feasts of power, pride, and pleasure. And the more elite the guest list, the more decadent the night became. Lupercalia may have disappeared from the calendar, but its spirit never fully left Roman culture. If the street no longer allowed for public rituals of excess, the private home stepped in to replace it. And in no setting was that more visible than in the elite Roman banquet. These gatherings started with food and flattery, but rarely ended there. For the ruling class, a dinner party was not just about hospitality, it was a performance, an opportunity to display wealth, status, and sexual access all in one luxurious evening. The guests were chosen carefully: powerful men, rising politicians, artists, poets, and sometimes their mistresses or favourites. The atmosphere grew looser with every cup of wine. At first, the discussion stayed political or philosophical, but the later the hour, the more personal everything became. Jokes sharpened, hands wandered, bodies shifted closer. The servants knew the signs. They dimmed the lights, poured stronger wine, and made space for what came next. A Roman banquet without sex was like a theatre with no actors, empty, strange, and missing the point. These evenings often ended in collective acts that blurred the lines between host and guest. Pleasure and power. Slaves were expected to join in. Prostitutes were brought in ahead of time, waiting in the side rooms or even already present at the table. Gender didn't matter, neither did age, as long as everyone played their part in the host's performance of indulgence. There were no rules except one: the host had to be in control. These weren't orgies in the modern sense of mutual abandon. They were carefully choreographed spectacles where hierarchy stayed intact. The host initiated. The guests followed. Those who hesitated risked seeming uptight or, worse, disloyal. A guest who withdrew too early might find himself excluded from future gatherings. And in Rome, losing access to these circles could mean losing everything. For the slaves and prostitutes, it was simply another part of their labour. They were passed between guests without pause. Some were praised for their beauty or skill. Others were laughed at, discarded, and called back later if someone changed their mind. There was no privacy, no dignity, only the rhythm of pleasure and display. What mattered was the mood, the pace, the sense that something extraordinary, something Roman, was happening. These banquets often included musicians, poets, and dancers, but eventually the entertainment turned physical. It became a challenge. Who could last the longest? Who could shock the room? Who could seduce the most partners in one night? Stories of legendary parties circulated for years. Senators who boasted of bedding 3 slaves in a row. Generals who laughed as they shared concubines with their subordinates. These weren't secrets. They were trophies. It's disturbing how often the line between celebration and exploitation was not just crossed but erased entirely. There was no consideration of consent from the lower classes. Their presence was assumed, their participation was mandatory, and their pain, if noticed, was treated as part of the experience. A powerful man could laugh about breaking a wine cup in bed but never mention the bruises on the boy beneath him. The structure of these events was mirrored in Roman values. Excess was not a flaw. It was a sign of achievement. To host a dull banquet was a social sin. To host a memorable one, even if it ended in chaos, secured your reputation. Men competed for influence through these displays, and women, if present, often played decorative roles or participated to elevate their husband's standing. Some parties were themed: Greek nights with togas and lyres, Egyptian feasts with dancers in golden masks, mythical reenactments where guests acted out scenes of seduction and conquest. The more creative the host, the more memorable the night. But beneath the costumes and music, the same principle remained: power expressed through appetite. Appetite is measured by how much you can consume and command. These events became so legendary that some philosophers condemned them. Seneca wrote about the corruption of Roman youth, blaming the banquet halls more than the battlefields. Others described the evenings with reluctant awe, acknowledging the brilliance of the host even as they cringed at the aftermath. But rarely did anyone speak for the ones used. Their names didn't survive, only their function. For those who lived to serve at these tables, the nights bled into each other. Pleasure for some meant exhaustion for others. There are records of slaves collapsing from overwork, of women crying silently in corners while laughter roared around them. But no law stopped it. No authority stepped in. It was, after all, private property. And in Rome, a man's home was his empire. What fascinates now is how normalised it was. These weren't secret gatherings in shadowy villas. They were part of elite social life. Children born from these evenings were sometimes raised openly. Others were discarded or sent away. But the banquets continued, year after year, generation after generation, as if the empire itself depended on proving that no desire was too great and no limit too sacred. It's hard not to feel that Roman pride was built as much on cruelty as it was on conquest. They conquered lands and people, but also bodies and silence, and they celebrated that conquest not just with statues and victories, but with long nights where nothing was off limits and no one was safe. Next, we leave the banquet hall and enter the walls of their homes and bathhouses, where even the architecture tells a story. Because in Rome, sex wasn't hidden in bedrooms. It was carved into the walls, painted beside the bed, and worshipped in temples. Welcome to the art of domination. If Roman banquets were places to act out sexual power, Roman walls were places to display it. You didn't need to attend a feast to know what Rome valued. You only had to look around. The erotic wasn't hidden in secret corners. It was carved into columns, painted across bedrooms, and scratched onto public walls. The city was a gallery of desire. But more than that, it was a gallery of control, dominance, and everything that lay beneath the surface of a Roman discipline. Walk through the ruins of Pompeii and Herculaneum, and the first thing you'll notice is how unshy the art is. Bedrooms with paintings of couples in every position. Hallways with frescoes of group sex. Even bakeries and taverns featured carvings of large erect penises surrounded by symbols of luck. These weren't jokes. They were reminders. Power was measured not only in money or weapons, but also in virility. The male body, always erect, always victorious, was everywhere. In Rome, even the kitchen wall might cheer you on with a giant stone phallus and a wink. Public toilets had erotic graffiti, bathhouses had ceiling frescoes showing scenes of sexual conquest, and homes, no matter how elegant, often included art that would make today's museums hesitate. It was not considered scandalous, it was considered Roman. The phallus was especially sacred. Called the fascinum, it wasn't just decoration, it was protection. Romans believed that images of the penis could ward off evil. They placed them above doorways, in children's rooms, even around their necks as charms. Some were small and discreet, others were bold, with wings or eyes or even legs. The message was clear. Sexual power wasn't shameful, it was magical. holy, even. But the imagery wasn't just limited to heterosexual scenes. Roman art included same-sex couples, both male and female, often portrayed in acts that reinforced the idea of hierarchy. The dominant partner was idealized, the passive one often stylized as lower in status. Group sex was also common in wall art, especially in brothels, where the images acted as both menu and instruction. What today would be considered pornography was, for them, a kind of cultural wallpaper. Some of the most detailed erotic art has been found in the suburban villas of the wealthy. These weren't public taverns, they were private retreats, and still, the walls were filled with scenes that mixed mythology and sex. Zeus seducing mortals, satyrs chasing nymphs, gods transforming into animals to fulfill their desires. These stories were known by everyone. They justified human behaviour by pointing to the divine. If Jupiter could cheat, so could you. Children were not shielded from these images. They grew up surrounded by them. It wasn't unusual for a boy to learn the alphabet by reading graffiti on a wall that also described someone's latest bedroom conquest. There were no censorship laws, no separation between art and anatomy, and while the elite might pretend to be cultured in their interpretations, the purpose of the images was often as physical as the acts they showed. What's incredible is how much of it survived. Even after volcanic ash buried entire cities, the walls kept speaking. Excavations in the 18th and 19th centuries uncovered hundreds of erotic frescoes, many of which were quickly hidden away. Museums called them obscene and locked them in restricted archives. Scholars debated whether Rome had been depraved, but to the Romans themselves, this art was just part of the furniture. They didn't use curtains to hide their pleasures. They used statues to honour them. Penises carved into milestones, into household shrines, even into the handles of oil lamps. One popular motif showed Mercury, the god of commerce, alongside a phallus, as if reminding merchants that success required more than gold. Another common figure was Priapus, a rustic god always depicted with an impossibly large erection, guarding gardens like a fertility scarecrow. The temples were no different. In places where people came to worship, images of sex were painted on the ceiling. Some shrines offered figurines or clay tablets showing lovers in explicit positions, asking the gods for passion, fertility, or domination. Even in death, the imagery remained. Tombs carried inscriptions with sexual puns or references to former conquests. A man might be remembered not for kindness, but for stamina. This culture of visual sexuality wasn't without critics. Philosophers like Cicero and Seneca occasionally questioned the morality of public eroticism, but their voices were outnumbered. Most Romans, even those in high office, saw no contradiction between power and pleasure. A general might kneel at a temple one day and host an erotic poetry contest the next. It was all part of a balanced life. The deeper message of these images was not about lust, it was about hierarchy. The art reinforced who should be in charge, who should submit, who deserved pleasure, and who was meant to provide it. Even when the scene was playful or mythical, the roles were clear. Roman sexuality, even in paint, was a mirror of Roman society. What makes it unsettling is how normal it all was. No one flinched, no one whispered. They laughed, pointed, and sometimes added their own drawings beside the originals. The walls didn't need ears, they had mouths, and they repeated the same message again and again: dominance is beauty, submission is forgettable. Next, we'll go deeper into that message, not through paint or stone, but through the tools Romans left behind. Because if the walls could talk, the objects in their drawers could whisper something even stranger. From carved dildos to scented oils, from bronze mirrors to locked belts, the Roman appetite for control extended even to the instruments they used in bed. Let's open the drawer. The walls of Roman homes made their pleasures visible, but the drawers, the boxes, the private corners of those same homes told an even more intimate story. While paintings showed what Romans believed about sex, The objects they used showed how they practiced it. Their appetite was not limited to partners, it extended to tools, devices crafted from wood, leather, and metal, some ordinary in form, others strange, all of them designed to stimulate, to dominate, or to entertain. These weren't accidents of history. They were built with purpose, and in Rome, that purpose was never questioned. Dildos, for example, have been unearthed in villas and bathhouses, stored carefully like any other household item. Some were carved from wood, others shaped in bronze. A few were covered in leather. Their size and shape varied, but the intention behind them was clear. They weren't religious, they weren't artistic, they were meant for use, and they weren't hidden. Their presence didn't cause a scandal. Instead, they reflected a world where sexual curiosity had physical outlets. It's one thing to imagine Roman indulgence, another to find the instruments still waiting where they were last left. These weren't symbolic relics. They had worn. They had design details meant to make them more effective. Some even included rings for grip or attachments to be worn. Their existence suggests not just openness, but experimentation. Pleasure wasn't passive, it was engineered. Lubricants were common too. Romans had no shortage of ingredients. Olive oil was the most widely used, found in nearly every household and in nearly every kind of intimacy. But for more refined experiences, they turned to honey, animal fat, and scented ointments. Recipes were passed down in herbal manuals. Some included ingredients meant to arouse, to numb, or to perfume. These weren't secret recipes. They were shared like any beauty routine or health tip. These substances weren't limited to bedroom use. In brothels, attendants applied oil before and after encounters, often warming it beforehand. The scent became part of the experience, sweet or musky, depending on the mixture. In wealthier homes, slaves kept small jars ready near beds or in bathing areas. They were as essential as wine, as familiar as incense, and once again, their presence didn't cause discomfort. They were as Roman as sandals, but the tools went beyond handheld objects. The Romans built furniture with sex in mind. Some chairs were designed to support unusual positions, others had hand grips or adjustable angles. Beds in brothels were often set into stone, the mattress added on top. Some included shallow basins underneath, which are easy to clean. Even household couches, where guests might recline during a feast, could be repurposed when the night turned physical. The lines between rest and indulgence blurred easily. Imagine IKEA releasing a line called Domus Erotica and no one batting an eye. That's what Rome was. Furniture that served pleasure wasn't taboo. It was practical. If a man could afford a better chariot or a better sword, why not a better bed for his tastes? The logic was consistent. Comfort and conquest were always close. There's evidence of harnesses too, leather straps, bronze buckles, sometimes attached to walls or bedposts. Scholars debate their exact use, but the most likely explanation involves restraint, not as punishment, but as stimulation. For Romans, control over the body was a mark of authority. Being able to bind another, physically or socially, was part of their identity. The same hands that signed decrees might tie a knot just as carefully. Some temples even featured statues holding or standing beside these kinds of objects. Priapus, the rustic fertility god, was often shown with exaggerated anatomy, leaning against a post or balancing a scale. In some regions, small wooden dildos were offered as votive gifts. A prayer for fertility, pleasure, or the healing of sexual dysfunction. Religion didn't hide these things, it absorbed them. Even travelling Romans brought their tools. Portable kits, found in military camps and merchant homes, included miniature oils, small phallic charms, and sometimes collapsible accessories, just like grooming sets or coin purses. These items reflected daily life. The boundary between utility and intimacy was thin. To us, they seemed like artifacts. To them, they were conveniences. The presence of these tools across all classes tells us that this wasn't just elite behaviour. Market stalls sold cheaper versions. Some were made from clay or bone, easier to produce but less durable. There are graffiti references to customers buying used items, or artisans advertising their latest designs. Even the blacksmith could double as a craftsman of pleasure, shaping both blades and bedroom objects without changing the furnace. What's notable is how little judgment appears in the historical record. Satirists joked about size or performance, but rarely about the use of tools themselves. The critique, when it came, was directed at overuse or vanity. A man who depended too much on aids might be mocked for softness, but the tools weren't questioned. Their existence was proof of Roman values practical, direct, and willing to shape desire like any other aspect of life. What shocks modern audiences is not the tools themselves, but how ordinary they were in Roman hands. They weren't locked away. They were laid out, cared for, replaced when worn. The culture didn't treat sexual desire as something dangerous to manage, but as something to be refined, like taste or conversation. Of course, the freedom to use these tools was not shared equally. As always, slaves had no voice in how they were used. Women had less room to explore without consequence. And those at the bottom of society might use tools for others' pleasure, but never their own. Just because Rome built the devices didn't mean it gave everyone the right to enjoy them. Still, these objects survived. In museum drawers and archaeological sites, they sit quietly, holding the fingerprints of a culture that took physical desire seriously. Not in secret, not with shame, but with wood, oil, and iron. Next, we turn from tools to the ones who used them most visibly, not in bedrooms or temples, but in open markets and alleys. Because in Rome, not all lovers were free, and the most visible figures of Roman sexuality were often the most vulnerable the boys kept as favourites by powerful men. The tools of pleasure told one story. The people they used told another. In Rome, objects could be owned, but so could bodies. And in the higher circles of society, ownership was not just about labour, it extended into intimacy. Roman elites did not just collect statues or chariots. Some of them collected boys, carefully selected, closely watched, and completely controlled. These young companions served as living symbols of luxury and dominance. Their role was unspoken but understood. They were not adopted. They were not sons. They were for pleasure, known as delicia, meaning delights. These boys were often brought into elite homes as ornaments of indulgence. They came from conquered lands, slave markets, or poor Roman families who sold their children out of desperation. The wealthier the patron, the more exquisite the boy. He was trained not only in behaviour but in presentation. Hair curled, skin softened, body kept lean and youthful. In essence, he was turned into a decorative object that also happened to breathe. These boys were not hidden. They accompanied their patrons to banquets, rode with them in litters, and sometimes slept on cushions beside their feet during meetings. Their presence did not provoke outrage. It enhanced the status of the man who owned them. The ability to maintain such a companion required wealth, discretion, and a reputation strong enough to deflect criticism. In public, the boys might pour wine or recite poetry. In private, their duties were more personal. Consent was never part of the arrangement. These boys had no voice in what they were expected to provide. Some were as young as 10, taken before they could understand their role. They were expected to please, to obey, and above all, to never challenge the man who owned them. If they showed reluctance, they could be beaten. If they aged out, they could be discarded. In every sense, they were possessions. Imagine living in a world where your body was polished like silver and displayed like furniture, and no one found that strange. That was the world of the delicia. Their silence was not only expected, it was part of their appeal. To speak too much, to express emotion, was considered disruptive. The ideal boy was beautiful, quiet, and pliable, and for Roman men, This kind of control was not immoral, it was admired. Some emperors made this practice shockingly public. Nero famously married a boy named Sporus, dressing him in women's clothes and calling him his wife. Later, he played the husband to another young man, alternating roles depending on the crowd. Elagabalus, another emperor, kept an entire household of young male lovers, rewarding them with titles and gifts. These actions raised eyebrows, but not because of the boys. The criticism came when the emperor appeared too emotionally attached or behaved too much like the passive partner. The line was always about dominance. A man could surround himself with boys as long as he remained the master. Any sign that he was too tender, too soft, or too invested made him vulnerable to mockery. Roman poets like Martial and Juvenal used this tension in their verses, mocking senators who cried over their favourites or spent more on perfume for a boy than on their household. But the ownership itself was never mocked. That part was normal. These relationships were often long-term but rarely stable. A favourite might rise in influence, receiving better clothes, better food, and even property. But the position was precarious. One mistake, one shift in mood, and the boy could be replaced. He might be sold, sent away, or even punished publicly to demonstrate the master's detachment. There was no protection, no promise, only the illusion of intimacy. The boys, in turn, learned to adapt. Some became expert manipulators, using their beauty to gain favours. Others retreated inward, surviving by obedience and silence. And a few, tragically, ended their lives before being discarded. The system was not built to care for them. It was built to showcase the power of those who could afford them. Roman society rarely questioned the ethics of these arrangements. Philosophers debated virtue, but few condemned the practice outright. It was simply one of many ways that wealth expressed itself. A man might show off his garden, his library, his exotic birds, and his favourite boy in the same evening. Guests were expected to admire the selection, not challenge its morality. What makes it even darker is how ordinary it became. These boys appeared in love poems, plays, and gossip. Their names were known, but not remembered. Their youth was praised, but their futures were ignored. When they disappeared, no one asked why. Someone younger always took their place. The physical objects from earlier, dildos, restraints, and oils, were often used on these boys, not with them. The tools of Roman pleasure were rarely shared. They were applied to the bodies that could not say no, and that is what made it Roman. The absence of mutuality, the presence of control, the celebration of power without consequence. Some later Christian writers would condemn the practice, but by then it had already left its mark on the empire. The art, the poetry, the laws, they all reflect a culture that measured men by how many things they could possess, including people. And in that list, the delicia were just one more item, polished and placed like any other treasure. Next, we follow the logic of this control one step further. When the boundary of age disappeared, what else could, in the streets of Rome? Children did not just witness adult behaviour, they were pulled into it, sold, swapped, and used without shame. Because for Rome, power did not stop at the bedroom, it reached into the cradle. If Roman men could parade their boy companions in front of dinner guests without consequence, then it was no stretch for the empire to look past the boundaries of age entirely. The idea of a child being too young was not part of the Roman vocabulary. What mattered was whether they were useful, if they were quiet, obedient, and owned by someone else. Age became irrelevant. The younger the child, the less likely they are to resist. And in a world obsessed with dominance, that alone made them valuable. In Roman households, enslaved children were treated as tools, and the law did not require owners to consider their well-being. A child could be taken into the home to clean or serve, and just as easily expected to provide more intimate services. There were no age restrictions, no oversight, no protections. If the child were a slave, they could not refuse. If they were free but poor, their safety depended entirely on the generosity of those around them. It was a structure built for silence. In Rome, childhood was not a protected stage of life. It was just another rung on the ladder of control. A child could be bought, gifted, or inherited, and that transaction often included expectations that went far beyond labour. Masters who favoured young attendants were not shamed. They were admired for their taste. Their status made their choices untouchable, and the children themselves had no voice in the matter. Some of these children became known by name, usually in passing comments by poets or guests. A boy who poured wine with the right posture, or who sang in a soft enough voice, might be remembered briefly, but most faded into obscurity. Their presence was expected, their obedience assumed, and their aging punished with dismissal. Many were replaced before they had even grown into adolescence. Those who stayed longer often did so because they pleased their masters in ways that extended beyond service. Girls were rarely treated any better. Young girls born into slavery could be placed in brothels before their bodies were fully formed. Customers paid more for those described as untouched, and Roman brothel records reflect a grim fascination with youth. Some girls were given training in basic etiquette to serve wealthier clients. Others were kept in rougher establishments where their first encounters were brutal and fast. The law did not intervene. It simply taxed the establishment and kept a list of its earnings. In more elite homes, a girl might be kept as a concubine from childhood. She would live under the same roof as the wife, but serve a different role. If she became pregnant, the child would belong to the master, and the girl would be praised for her fertility. If she resisted or aged, she would be sold or assigned elsewhere. No one asked how she felt. That question didn't exist in the Roman structure. Usefulness was everything. Religious practices did not always offer shelter either. In some regions, fertility rites included young participants, especially girls chosen to symbolize purity or rebirth. These children were often expected to take part in symbolic marriages or intimate rituals, watched by the community and approved by tradition. Whether those rituals were spiritual or physical, the child's consent was never a consideration. The rite was older than the law, and in the Roman world, tradition carried weight. Writers from the time did not disguise these things. Some described the beauty of youthful limbs or the innocence of a trembling voice. Erotic poems made jokes about how young was too young. The satire targeted the aging patron who could not resist a boy of 10, but never questioned the system that made such a thing possible. The joke was always about taste, never about ethics. What disturbs us now is not just what happened, but how it was ignored. There were no reformers, no whistleblowers, no structure for justice. A child could be hurt, and no one would record it. The household would go on, the master's life would remain untouched, and the child would be replaced as if they had never existed. Those children who survived learned to adapt quickly. They smiled when expected. They stayed close but not too close. They understood silence as survival. Some gained small rewards like softer clothing or better food. Others were allowed to sleep indoors, but even those comforts were conditional. The power dynamic never changed. One wrong move, one sign of aging, and they were gone. A few philosophers hinted at discomfort. They wrote about moderation, about the importance of self-control. But even these voices were more concerned with how indulgence made a man look, not what it did to the person he used. There was no concept of psychological harm, no word for trauma. A child's pain did not carry forward. It stayed locked inside the walls where it began. Bathhouses were another space where children were exposed to risk. Young attendants scrubbed floors, carried towels, and sometimes received the wrong kind of attention. In the steam and laughter, age blurred. If a patron asked for more, the child could not refuse. The other patrons would look away, the owner would not interfere. In public spaces, the same rules applied. Power decided what was allowed, not principle. The silence in the historical record is not a sign that nothing happened. It is a sign that no one thought it mattered. These children were too small to write letters, too poor to commission statues, and too replaceable to be mourned. Their suffering was not erased. It was never written in the first place. Rome prided itself on order, discipline, and structure. It built aqueducts, roads, and forums that still stand. But under those stones were bodies that never had a say. Their names lost, their lives decided for them, their worth measured by how much they could endure without complaint. Next, we walk into the bathhouse itself, a place where the body was on full display, where privacy vanished in the steam, and where dominance played out as casually as conversation. In that heat, every touch had meaning, and the walls watched everything. After passing through the heavy silence of childhood exploitation, the Roman obsession with the body did not disappear. It simply stepped into the light. In the bustling bathhouses of Rome, nakedness was not hidden. It was expected. The bathhouse was the one place where class lines softened and fabrics vanished. Senators, merchants, slaves, and visitors could all enter the same steam-filled space, disrobe without shame, and submerge their bodies into water warmed by fires beneath the floor. In theory, these baths were places of cleansing. They had cold rooms, hot rooms, massage areas, and attendants offering oils and towels. But in practice, they became places of exposure. Not only physical exposure, but also social and sexual exposure. Once the tunic dropped, power dynamics changed. People watched one another. They noted scars, build, and grooming habits. Nudity was not neutral. It carried messages, especially in a society that read everything as a sign of status or submission. It was like attending a networking event where everyone was naked and pretending it was about health. Gossip moved through the steam faster than sound. Men compared themselves, not just in wealth or muscle, but in size and boldness. Some used the space to flaunt their youth, others their confidence. A few used it to seek company. The line between social gathering and sexual opportunity blurred in the condensation on the walls. Women were not excluded from this practice entirely. While some baths were single-gender by schedule, others allowed overlap, especially in provincial towns or during festivals. Roman literature and graffiti often suggest that mixed bathing was more common than elite writers like to admit. For many women, it was a chance to assert confidence or flirtation. For others, it was a requirement of work, especially if they were masseuses, entertainers, or slaves assisting guests. To be a woman in a Roman bathhouse meant being observed. There was no such thing as privacy. Some women embraced the gaze, using jewellery or strategic oils to draw attention. Others simply endured it, understanding that refusing to bathe in public could raise suspicion. In Rome, too much modesty looked unnatural. A woman who hid her body was thought to be sick, ashamed, or rebellious, and rebellion was rarely forgiven. Not surprisingly, acts beyond bathing occurred. There are accounts and caricatures of couples slipping away into corners, of suggestive games in the steam, of hands wandering beneath the water's surface. Some establishments became known for tolerating these behaviours. Others pretended not to notice. A man might enter for a soak and end up with more. A woman might accompany a patron and be expected to comply. No one kept records. No one asked questions. Bathhouses were the Roman version of a nightclub, a spa, and a gossip column rolled into one. They were places where reputations could be made or unmade. A chance meeting with a senator could lead to promotion. A casual comment could become tomorrow's scandal. Men discussed business while rubbing oil on one another's backs. Women watched from behind thin veils or towels, trying to maintain dignity in a space that encouraged curiosity. There was even a hierarchy among bathhouse staff. The oil boys, the towel carriers, the musicians, the prostitutes who lingered at the entrances, all played their roles. Some bathhouses had separate rooms for more private transactions. Others simply used the shadows between the columns. The boundaries were flexible. What mattered was who you were and how much you paid. That, more than morality, dictated what was acceptable. Public murals and statues inside these bathhouses reflected the same boldness. Erotic scenes painted above the pools, phallic symbols carved into benches, images of gods and mortals intertwined in suggestive positions. It was not pornography as we know it. It was a cultural expression of dominance, fertility, and beauty. Children saw it. Elders laughed at it. Visitors from outside Rome sometimes reacted with discomfort. But Romans themselves seemed immune to embarrassment. The empire's ability to normalize public nakedness was not without limits. Some conservative voices tried to speak against it. A few senators warned that mixed bathing weakened Roman values. Certain emperors